The Imperial Coronation, the act of self-crowning. The ascent of Napoleon Bonaparte from an artillery officer of the Revolution to the first consul of France was a triumph of military genius and ruthless political maneuvering. Yet, by 1804, Napoleon realized that the title of consul was insufficient for the power he wielded and the dynasty he intended to establish. The Republic itself was exhausted by instability and the continuous threat of internal plots and external wars. Stability demanded permanence, and permanence required a new form of monarchy disguised under a modern title. The decision to assume the title of Emperor of the French and establish a hereditary dynasty was the logical and inevitable culmination of the coup of 18 Brumaire, a final public rejection of the fragile revolutionary republic. This act was designed to serve two supreme purposes: to secure the revolutionary gains and to guarantee the absolute continuity of Napoleon's rule and his lineage. The motivation was rooted deeply in the need for legitimacy. Napoleon recognized that the old crowned heads of Europe, the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, the Hohenzollerns, who viewed him as nothing more than a Corsican upstart and a regicide, could never truly accept him as an equal while he remained merely the first consul of a chaotic republic. To be recognized on the international stage, to secure lasting peace, and to truly establish his family among the royal houses of Europe, he needed the traditional symbols of sovereign power. He needed a crown. Furthermore, the constant threat of assassination and royalist plotting weighed heavily on the new regime. The notorious Cadoudal conspiracy, a royalist plot to kidnap or kill Napoleon in 1804, highlighted the extreme fragility of the consulate. The conspirators believed that Napoleon's death would lead to the collapse of the Republic and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy. Napoleon expertly used the shock of this plot to argue that the only way to safeguard the nation and the revolutionary settlement was to make his rule permanent and hereditary, thus eliminating the hope of a Bourbon restoration after his death. The French Senate overwhelmingly supported the motion proclaiming Napoleon Emperor of the French, a title ratified by a massive popular plebiscite, a seemingly democratic confirmation of the end of the Republic.
Giọng nam trầm hoặc nam trầm thường truyền tải được sự nghiêm túc, quyền lực và hoành tráng tốt hơn, rất phù hợp với lịch sử quân sự. Giọng có độ vang không quá cao. Giọng trầm tạo cảm giác uy tín và sức nặng cho các phân tích lịch sử. Giọng đọc cần phải linh hoạt, nghiêm túc khi phân tích chiến thuật và kịch tính khi kể về các sự kiện bi tráng như cái chết của Marie Antoinette, tránh giọng robot hoặc quá nhanh. Tốc độ chậm hơn một chút so với tốc độ nói thông thường. Điều này cho phép người nghe tiếp thu các thông tin phức tạp và tăng thêm sự kịch tính. Giọng Anh Mỹ hoặc Anh chuẩn, không có giọng địa phương mạnh, đảm bảo sự rõ ràng và tiếp cận được khán giả toàn cầu. The political decision was made, but the symbolic execution of the transfer of power required an act of unprecedented grandeur, a ceremony that would visually surpass the coronations of the Bourbon kings and demonstrate the unique spiritual authority of the new emperor. Napoleon decided the event must take place in the heart of French history, the magnificent Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, and it must involve the single most powerful spiritual authority in the Western world, Pope Pius VII. Napoleon's demand that Pope Pius VII travel from Rome to Paris to preside over the coronation was a move of profound political and religious audacity. For centuries, the tradition in Europe had been that the Pope sanctioned the Holy Roman Emperor, a ritual that conveyed divine authority. By forcing the Pope to travel, Napoleon inverted this ancient dynamic. He demonstrated that the highest spiritual authority of Catholicism now served the political ambition of the French emperor, thereby subtly subordinating the Church to the state, a key revolutionary principle he intended to preserve. The negotiations were intense and delicate. Pius VII was deeply reluctant to legitimize a former revolutionary who had seized church lands. But he saw an opportunity to secure better conditions for Catholics in France following the 1801 Concordat, which had partially reconciled the Church and the Republic. The Pope reluctantly agreed, but the details of the ceremony were subject to fierce negotiation, designed by Napoleon himself to convey two contradictory messages: ancient legitimacy and revolutionary sovereignty. The ceremony was meticulously designed by the court artist Jacques-Louis David to be the most spectacular event in French history, visually overwhelming and symbolically complex. Every detail was calculated to link Napoleon's new dynasty to the grandeur of Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor of the Middle Ages, while simultaneously distinguishing him from the Bourbon kings. The emperor adopted the imperial symbols of the golden eagle, the hand of justice, and the ancient Roman laurel wreath. The venue, Notre Dame Cathedral, was chosen as a deliberate break from the traditional venue of Reims Cathedral, where the Bourbon kings had been consecrated. The sheer scale of the event was enormous.
Thousands of spectators lined the streets of Paris, and the interior of Notre Dame was opulently transformed with temporary marble columns, velvet, and gold hangings, a spectacle worthy of the new master of Europe. The attendance of nearly all of Napoleon's marshals and the presence of the highest echelons of the new French nobility created a visual display of the regime's power and stability. Yet the central, most crucial element of the entire ceremony remained the position of the Pope. The morning of December 2, 1804, was marked by meticulous preparation and intense security. The Pope had arrived, but his presence was a source of constant tension. The ceremonial procession from the Tuileries Palace to Notre Dame was intentionally magnificent, designed to overwhelm the senses of the Parisian public and erase the memory of the modest revolutionary rituals. Napoleon and Josephine were clad in robes of velvet and ermine, adorned with gold and diamonds, embodying the splendor of the ancient monarchies they were displacing. This entire spectacle was a deliberate contrast to the simple, austere clothing worn during the height of the Terror. The complex ceremony began inside Notre Dame, where the Pope waited. The most important moment of the entire ritual was the anointing, a sacred act where the Pope used oil to consecrate the monarch, a gesture that symbolically conveyed the grace of God upon the ruler. Napoleon consented to this ancient part of the ritual, acknowledging the symbolic weight of papal blessing. However, his true mastery lay in dictating the precise sequence of the crowning itself, a maneuver that would be etched into historical memory and analysis forever. The imperial regalia, the symbols of power, including the scepter, the hand of justice, and the two crowns, were brought forth. One was the crown of Charlemagne, a historical artifact symbolizing continuity with the great Holy Roman Empire. The other was the modern laurel wreath of the Roman emperor, chosen by Napoleon to link himself directly to the classical emperors of Rome. The Pope consecrated the crowns and prepared to place the main imperial crown upon Napoleon's head, thus completing the traditional religious sanctification. It was at this precise moment that Napoleon performed the act that defined his reign and the very nature of his power.
Giọng nam trầm hoặc nam trầm thường truyền tải được sự nghiêm túc, quyền lực và hoành tráng tốt hơn, rất phù hợp với lịch sử. Giọng có độ vang không quá cao. Giọng trầm tạo cảm giác uy tín và sức nặng cho các phân tích lịch sử. Giọng đọc cần phải linh hoạt, nghiêm túc khi phân tích chiến thuật và kịch tính khi kể về các sự kiện bi tráng như cái chết của Marie Antoinette. Tránh giọng robot hoặc quá nhanh. Tốc độ chậm hơn một chút so với tốc độ nói thông thường. Điều này cho phép người nghe tiếp thu các thông tin phức tạp và tăng thêm sự kịch tính. Giọng Anh Mỹ hoặc Anh chuẩn, không có giọng địa phương mạnh, đảm bảo sự rõ ràng và tiếp cận được khán giả toàn cầu. As the Pope raised the main crown to perform the central act of the consecration, Napoleon suddenly and decisively reached out, grasped the crown, and placed it firmly upon his own head. This act of self-coronation was not a spontaneous outburst. It was a carefully planned theatrical event designed to send an unmistakable message to the world. The act of self-coronation performed by Napoleon was the single most important symbolic moment of his entire reign. It instantly and unequivocally defined the nature of the new empire and its relationship to the past. By taking the crown from the hands of Pope Pius VII and placing it upon his own head, Napoleon was not merely asserting his independence from Rome. He was sending a revolutionary message to every monarch in Europe. That message was crystal clear. His power was derived not from God or hereditary right, but from his own military genius, his will, and the mandate of the French people, the very essence of the revolutionary settlement. The Pope's role was thereby reduced from a consecrator of divine right to a mere highly respected spectator to a political reality that he could neither prevent nor control. This action was a deliberate rejection of the Bourbon tradition. For centuries, French kings had been crowned and anointed by the Archbishop of Reims, signifying their authority flowed directly from God through the Church. Napoleon replaced this ancient spiritual chain of command with a purely secular meritocratic foundation. He was declaring himself the Emperor of the French, a title recognizing the people as the source of sovereignty, rather than the King of France, a title recognizing the territory as the source of power. This distinction was vital. The scene then continued its calculated drama. After crowning himself emperor, Napoleon turned and crowned his wife Josephine as empress. This public act elevated his wife and validated his new dynasty, while simultaneously reinforcing his personal authority. Even in this most emotional and grandest of gestures, Napoleon was the sole dispenser of power, the ultimate source of authority for his entire family. His mother, Letizia Bonaparte, was present, a symbolic validation of his lineage, but she famously refused to attend the formal ceremony itself, a subtle but sharp protest against her son's excessive ambition. The overall political impact of the self-coronation was immense. It served as a final theatrical closure to the revolution's chaotic parliamentary phase, replacing it with the stability of a single powerful figure. It legitimized the transfer of power and provided the international community with a formal structure they could engage with. The coronation was a spectacular moment of transition, replacing the execution of the king with the crowning of the new emperor, completing the cycle of revolutionary violence and the subsequent search for order.
The reaction to Napoleon's coronation, and especially the act of self-coronation, was immediate, complex, and highly mixed across Europe. Pope Pius VII, despite the public humiliation of having his role usurped, managed to maintain a facade of solemnity and spiritual acceptance. He gained very little practical power from the event, but salvaged some moral authority by maintaining his spiritual presence at the consecration. Privately, he was furious at Napoleon's arrogance, a resentment that would contribute significantly to future conflicts between the Empire and the papacy, eventually leading to the Pope's arrest. The crowned heads of Europe reacted with a mixture of outrage and grudging acknowledgement. The Habsburg Emperor Francis II of the Holy Roman Empire, who would soon reorganize his own title to Francis I of Austria, viewed Napoleon's adoption of the imperial title as a direct, unacceptable usurpation of an ancient dignity. He and the Tsar Alexander I of Russia publicly maintained their refusal to recognize Napoleon as an emperor, seeing him as a dangerous revolutionary parvenu, an upstart dictator with a newly acquired crown. However, the political reality was undeniable. Napoleon commanded the most powerful army on the continent. The various smaller German states and Italian principalities, acutely aware of French military might, quickly offered their congratulations and formal recognition. The coronation signaled the definitive end of the Republic and the beginning of a military-driven imperial state, which, ironically, made Napoleon easier to negotiate with than the unpredictable revolutionary Directory. Monarchs understood a fellow monarch, even a self-made one, better than a mob-ruled legislative body. The crowning was a clear message that Napoleon intended to rule not just France, but to reshape the entire political map of the continent according to his own will and the logic of his own military power. The ceremony also served a moment of profound cultural shift. Napoleon utilized the coronation to cement the status of his entire family and the new meritocratic elite of the empire. The marshals of France, generals who had risen from obscurity through sheer talent during the Revolution, were elevated to the dignity of princes and dukes, forming a new imperial nobility whose status was based on service to the state, not birthright. The visual splendor of the event was a deliberate attempt to legitimize this new class structure, linking the rough soldiers of the Revolution to the ancient glamour of empire. This mixing of revolutionary meritocracy with imperial pomp was a unique feature of the Napoleonic system. The coronation was also a deeply significant moment for Joséphine de Beauharnais, the newly minted empress. Her presence at the side of Napoleon symbolized the union of the new political power with the remnants of the old French aristocracy, a crucial factor in soothing the fears of many returning émigrés and legitimizing the regime's social standing. By crowning Joséphine, Napoleon not only elevated his wife, but symbolically elevated the entire new meritocratic elite of the empire. She was the empress of a dynasty born from genius, not from birthright. Joséphine herself played her role perfectly, radiating a necessary blend of solemnness and grace that lent dignity to the hastily assembled court. However, the ceremony itself immediately highlighted the most profound and dangerous challenge facing the new empire, the issue of dynastic continuity. The coronation was intended to establish a hereditary line, but Josephine, despite her title, was unable to bear Napoleon a legitimate male heir, a fact that became a public state matter rather than a private tragedy. The necessity of securing the revolutionary gains and the stability of the empire through blood succession weighed heavily on Napoleon. The public spectacle of the coronation only served to underline this stark vulnerability. Napoleon had successfully taken the crown, but the issue of who would inherit it remained tragically unresolved. Napoleon used the coronation to demonstrate his absolute mastery over every aspect of the state, including the military, the judiciary, and the church. He consolidated the power of his family, appointing his siblings as princes and princesses and creating a new hierarchy designed to serve his imperial will. This move was not only about rewarding loyalty, but about creating a stable network of subordinates tied directly to his own success.
Giọng nam trầm hoặc nam trầm thường truyền tải được sự nghiêm túc, quyền lực và hoành tráng, epic tốt hơn, rất phù hợp với lịch sử quân sự. Giọng có độ vang, không quá cao. Giọng trầm tạo cảm giác uy tín và sức nặng cho các phân tích lịch sử. Giọng đọc cần phải linh hoạt, nghiêm túc khi phân tích chiến thuật và kịch tính khi kể về các sự kiện bi tráng như cái chết của Marie Antoinette. Tránh giọng robot hoặc quá nhanh. Tốc độ chậm hơn một chút so với tốc độ nói thông thường. Điều này cho phép người nghe tiếp thu các thông tin phức tạp và tăng thêm sự kịch tính. Giọng Anh Mỹ hoặc Anh chuẩn, không có giọng địa phương mạnh, đảm bảo sự rõ ràng và tiếp cận được khán giả toàn cầu. The entire grand performance was a meticulous declaration that the revolutionary experiment was over, replaced by the stability of a single powerful imperial family. The ceremony also subtly communicated a message of French cultural supremacy. By forcing the Pope to travel to Paris and by choosing the Roman laurel wreath, Napoleon positioned France as the successor to the great classical empires, bypassing the fragmented authority of the German Holy Roman Empire. The dazzling display of French wealth and artistic ability reflected in the vast decorations and the portraits commissioned from David reinforced the image of France as the cultural and political center of the new Europe, an image that provided deep national pride and support for the populace weary of foreign condemnation. The coronation's enduring visual legacy was cemented by the colossal painting commissioned from Jacques-Louis David, Napoleon's official court painter and the Revolutionary Era's most celebrated artist. David's task was formidable: to capture the grandeur and symbolic complexity of the 6-hour ceremony in a single canvas. The resulting masterpiece, the consecration of the Emperor Napoleon and the coronation of Empress Josephine, is an invaluable historical document and a brilliant piece of propaganda. It is important to note that David's painting is not strictly accurate to the historical event. It is an idealized representation of Napoleon's political will. David deliberately altered several key historical details to suit Napoleon's narrative. Firstly, he did not paint the moment Napoleon crowned himself. That act, while politically crucial, was deemed too raw and disrespectful to the church for the public image Napoleon wished to project later. Instead, David depicted the moment immediately following: Napoleon crowning Josephine. This choice softened the image of the emperor, portraying him as a figure of chivalry and a generous dispenser of authority, rather than a defiant upstart. Secondly, David included Napoleon's mother, Letizia Bonaparte, seated prominently in the imperial box.
In historical reality, Letizia refused to attend the ceremony in protest of her son's ambition and his conflict with his brothers. Her inclusion in the painting was pure propaganda, designed to convey the indispensable image of a unified, supportive imperial family, essential for the dynastic legitimacy Napoleon craved.
Giọng nghiêm túc, quyền lực và hoành tráng, epic tốt hơn, rất phù hợp với lịch sử quân sự. Giọng có độ vang, không quá cao. Giọng trầm tạo cảm giác uy tín và sức nặng cho các phân tích lịch sử. Giọng đọc cần phải linh hoạt, nghiêm túc khi phân tích chiến thuật và kịch tính khi kể về các sự kiện bi tráng như cái chết của Marie Antoinette. Tránh giọng robot hoặc quá nhanh. Tốc độ chậm hơn một chút so với tốc độ nói thông thường. Điều này cho phép người nghe tiếp thu các thông tin phức tạp và tăng thêm sự kịch tính. Giọng Anh, Mỹ hoặc Anh chuẩn, không có giọng địa phương mạnh, đảm bảo sự rõ ràng và tiếp cận được khán giả toàn cầu. The painting's sheer scale, combined with its detailed depiction of the opulent costumes, the prominent display of the imperial symbols, the eagle, the hand of justice, and the inclusion of all the newly created marshals and dignitaries, served to validate the entire social and political architecture of the new empire. It linked the military triumph of the revolution directly to the inherited splendor of the classical past, creating a powerful, accessible mythology for the French populace. The event and David's subsequent art profoundly communicated the idea of French cultural supremacy. By transforming the traditional act of coronation into a spectacle of meritocratic achievement and classical Roman authority, Napoleon positioned France as the successor to the great classical empires, deliberately bypassing the fragmented and antiquated authority of the Holy Roman Empire and the German states. This dazzling display of French wealth, artistic ability, and political innovation provided immense national pride and contributed to the widespread domestic support he received. The coronation was not merely a domestic celebration of Napoleon's success, it was a profound act of foreign policy and strategic messaging. By transforming the volatile French Republic into a stable hereditary empire, Napoleon made himself legible to the traditional crowned heads of Europe, even as they despised his revolutionary origins. The coronation was designed to fulfill a critical diplomatic need. It created a formal, predictable structure with which the great powers of Europe could negotiate. The adoption of the imperial title instantly served as a challenge to the Habsburg dynasty, whose ruler was the traditional Holy Roman Emperor. Napoleon positioned himself as the rightful successor to the classical Roman emperors, deliberately undermining the legitimacy of the Habsburgs' ancient claim to imperial authority over the German states. This move forced Francis II to immediately elevate his own title from Holy Roman Emperor to simply Francis I, Emperor of Austria, demonstrating the immediate, profound ripple effect of Napoleon's self-coronation on the European hierarchy. Furthermore, the coronation was an attempt to stabilize France's relationship with the rest of Europe by signaling the end of revolutionary export. By donning the crown and robes, Napoleon implicitly promised the surrounding monarchies that the age of radical republicanism, regicide, and violent revolutionary upheaval was over. He presented himself as a conservative force capable of maintaining order, a message that resonated deeply with the nervous aristocracies of Prussia and Russia, who were terrified of Jacobin ideals crossing their borders.
The display of opulence and the subordination of the Pope were assurances that the new French regime respected hierarchy, even if that hierarchy was entirely new. However, the coronation ultimately failed to achieve Napoleon's ultimate diplomatic goal, lasting peace. The European monarchs saw the ceremony not as an act of stabilization, but as an act of profound, unparalleled arrogance. They perceived the self-crowning as an insult to their own inherited divine rights and a threat to the continental balance of power. The splendor of the event only fueled the fear that Napoleon's ambition knew no bounds. Within months of the coronation, Great Britain, Austria, and Russia formed the Third Coalition, uniting to destroy the newly crowned emperor before his power could become absolute. The coronation, intended to secure peace and legitimacy, merely accelerated the coming of the next major war. The coronation of December 2, 1804, was the definitive end of the French Revolution and the foundational moment of the Napoleonic Empire. It was the final theatrical resolution to the decade-long search for stable government, replacing the fragile and corrupt Directory with the permanent authority of a single man. The event marked Napoleon's final rejection of abstract republican ideals in favor of pragmatic, centralized power and dynastic ambition. The legacy of the event is twofold. Politically, it cemented the power of the new meritocratic elite, the marshals and the civil servants, whose status was now guaranteed by the imperial crown. It gave the French populace the stability and national glory they desperately craved after years of chaos and civil strife. Personally, the act of self-coronation remains Napoleon's most powerful statement of self-made genius. By taking the crown from the Pope's hands, he declared to history that his authority came from no man, no church, and no inherited right, but solely from his own will and his undeniable success, a concept that fundamentally belonged to the revolutionary age he purported to end.
Giọng nam trầm hoặc nam trầm thường truyền tải được sự nghiêm túc, quyền lực và hoành tráng epic tốt hơn, rất phù hợp với lịch sử quân sự. Giọng có độ vang, không quá cao. Giọng trầm tạo cảm giác uy tín và sức nặng cho các phân tích lịch sử. Giọng đọc cần phải linh hoạt, nghiêm túc khi phân tích chiến thuật và kịch tính khi kể về các sự kiện bi tráng như cái chết của Marie Antoinette. Tránh giọng robot hoặc quá nhanh. Tốc độ chậm hơn một chút so với tốc độ nói thông thường. Điều này cho phép người nghe tiếp thu các thông tin phức tạp và tăng thêm sự kịch tính. Giọng Anh Mỹ hoặc Anh chuẩn, không có giọng địa phương mạnh, đảm bảo sự rõ ràng và tiếp cận được khán giả toàn cầu. The coronation transformed the general into the emperor, creating the very entity that the rest of Europe mobilized to destroy. It secured his dynasty and his life, but it guaranteed 20 more years of continuous warfare. The splendor displayed in Notre Dame was the opulent prelude to the great military campaigns that would soon engulf the continent, confirming that the French Empire, born of military necessity, would be sustained by military conquest. The crown was achieved, but the battle for its permanence had just begun.